of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to talk about this important issue about induction of puberty in Turner syndrome, particularly Dr. Ram Mohan, who has been in contact with me. Okay, so the definition of Turner syndrome is that first of all, they should be unambiguously female. On external genitalia wise, they should be unambiguously female. Secondly, the karyotype should have one normal X chromosome, and the second X chromosome should be either partially absent or completely absent. And along with that, there should be clinical features of Turner syndrome in the form of short stature, hypogonadism, particularly that is primary hypogonadism, certain skeletal features like wide carrying angle or Madelung deformity or kyphoscoliosis, autoimmune phenomena like hypothyroidism, or you have inflammatory bowel disease, celiac, sprue, type 1 diabetes, and cardiovascular features like dilatation of the root of the aorta or bicuspid aortic valve, and renal anomalies. So, and also events which are related to lymphatic edema, like you have your this thing, webbed neck, or coarctation of aorta, or edema of the hands and feet. So the sequelae of this also will constitute Turner syndrome. But suppose you have only got one X chromosome and a minimal deletion in the other X chromosome, that would not constitute Turner syndrome. So the diagnosis is based upon karyotyping, and we need to assess at least 20 cells in metaphase, and this will detect mosaicism of more than 10%. But if you strongly suspect, if the initial test is negative and you strongly suspect that the patient has Turner syndrome based upon clinical features and primary hypogonadism, then we may either go for additional cells to be checked for lower degrees of mosaicism, or we can do FISH studies to look for X chromosome sequences and know whether this mosaicism is there in some of the cells. And if blood itself is not giving us karyotype of Turner, and you strongly suspect Turner, other tissues like skin fibroblast, buccal mucosa, or urinary, in the urine you can check the bladder epithelial cells. They can also be checked if the blood karyotype is normal. But in women more than 40 years of age, we don't take mosaicism less than 5% as significant. But in persons less than that age group and adolescents, etc., any degree of mosaicism can be considered as Turner. There's no clearly defined level of mosaicism which rules out Turners. Talking of the pubertal events in a patient with Turner. So two types of pubertal events can take place. One, there may be virilization, or maybe three types. One is virilization. The second is non-development of female secondary sexual characteristics. And the third possibility is that you have spontaneous entry into puberty on the female line. So these three possibilities are there. So first we will talk about one event at puberty, that is virilization. So Y chromosomal sequences are present in around 10% of the patients with Turner syndrome, but karyotype can only identify mosaicism, where an entire Y chromosome is present in intact form in some of the cells, but not in all the cells. So that kind of karyotype can only help you to detect that. But sometimes karyotype can identify small pieces of the Y chromosome which are structurally there, for example, attached to an autosome or lying independently, which we call as a small marker chromosome or a ring chromosome. But to identify that these are derived from the Y chromosome, one has to look for Y chromosomal components by FISH, that is fluorescent in situ hybridization, where we use probes which are attached to fluorescent dye, and using these probes we attach to specific DNA sequences of the Y chromosome, and thereby we identify small pieces of chromosome as being derived from the Y chromosome. And in case you are having a virilized Turner, a Turner who is getting virilized, then if the blood karyotype is normal, you still have to look for evidence of Y chromosomal material in other tissues. Like I told earlier, But here the importance is much more because the patient is otherwise diagnosed as Turner, but now is having features of virilization. So you need to look for the Y chromosomal material in these patients. But the sequence against which the FISH is directed, that is not SRY, because SRY only determines whether the gonad will develop in which direction, but does not determine the risk of gonadoblastoma. Rather, it is pericentromeric sequences in and around the centromere of the Y chromosome, which determine the likelihood of gonadoblastoma. So in a virilizing Turner syndrome, you have to make an aggressive search for Y chromosomal material in more than one tissue, if necessary in the blood, if not in the blood, then in other tissues also, using FISH. But even more than FISH, you have, if FISH is also negative, you can do real-time PCR, again, with multiple Y-specific probes, which are close to the center, which are fitting with sequences close to the centromere. These may be a little bit more sensitive than FISH. But it does not mean that everybody with Turner syndrome who has a XO karyotype or XO-XX karyotype, everybody does not require a FISH or RT-PCR. It is basically indicated only for the cases who are showing signs of virilization. And the gonadoblastoma risk is it has been in different studies varied from 4 to 60%, but on average it may be around 10%. So you have to do this. Virilization usually occurs only after puberty. Before puberty, there is no gonadotropins are not high, so virilization won't occur. So whenever you see the virilization, then only you have to go for the gonadectomy. The purpose of gonadectomy one is to interdict the development of a gonadoblastoma, to prevent it, and second thing is to take care of the virilization. So this is one kind of pivotal event which occurs in Turner syndrome. The second pivotal event is non-development of secondary sexual characteristics. So it's not that everybody does not develop secondary sexual characteristics. About 1/3 of Turner patients, they may have their spontaneous thelarchy, and then the puberty may get arrested, and around 6% may even progress to regular menstrual cycles. So what you need to do is monitor the LH and FSH annually from the age of 11 years in Turners. But many cases of Turners are actually diagnosed after that point of time because of delayed puberty. In those cases, the LH FSH will naturally be high. Another way could be inhibin and low AMH. They also predict ovarian failure, but they are not of any extra value here. It is simply the rise in FSH which becomes the indication for starting treatment. And if the gonadotropins are normal, we don't need to treat, but we need to monitor them annually and only wait for the FSH to rise before we start treating with hormone replacement. So what is the indication for treatment? The indication of treatment is that the patient should have already crossed actually a born age of 11 to 12 years. But then at 11 to 12 years, the Turner born age, and the chronological age are usually the same. It's only later on that the born age lags the chronological age. At this stage, the born age and chronological age are almost the same. And the second requirement is that the FSH has to be elevated. So once these two requirements are fulfilled, then we have to treat them with puberty induction, which is the main topic of the talk today. And what is the objective of puberty induction, of giving hormone replacement therapy? First is to induce the puberty, but then after induction up to the time of menopause, we have to maintain it also. So both induction and maintenance of the female secondary sexual characteristics. The second thing is to achieve an adequate bone mass, because peak bone mass is usually achieved in the early part of the third decade. And if estrogen therapy is delayed or not given, then not only there will be non-functional epiphysis, but also there will be inadequate bone mass, and throughout life, the patient will be at risk for osteoporotic fracture. And another objective is also there, but it's a very different one. Is the fertility objective. For fertility, you need a receptacle for the baby. So that receptacle is the uterus. Uterus is actually small in patients with Turner syndrome, and even with the treatment of estrogen, you don't always get a normal uterus size. If treating with reasonably high doses of estrogen, such as ethinyl estradiol OCPs, which have 20 to 30 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol, even when you treat with such a high dose of estrogen, only 50% of the uterus achieve the adult height volume of a another adult normal female. So there is still a problem that even if you give estrogen, you can induce the puberty, but it's not always possible to ensure adequate growth of the uterus to carry a pregnancy. And then these are the objectives basically. But apart from the objectives, we do have two other benefits of estrogen replacement therapy. And the first is that most of these people with Turner syndrome, they have non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and even in the absence of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, they have elevated SGOT and SGPT. And it is just a remarkable finding that the elevated SGOT and SGPT in Turners improves with the administration of estrogen. Both the oral estrogen as well as transdermal estrogen are equally effective in suppressing the liver enzyme. So that is additional benefit we get. And second thing is the improvement in the health-related quality of life, and that is simply because of the improvement in the self-esteem and induction of secondary sexual characteristics. So then the question arises, what are the available routes of estrogen therapy and what is preferred for patients with Turner syndrome? So one route is the oral route, but then if you take estrogen orally, it will get absorbed into the portal vein, go directly to the liver, and the liver dose to exposure to estrogen will be higher than the tissue exposure to estrogen elsewhere. And this higher estrogen exposure to the liver leads to the production of procoagulant factors which are derived in the liver, and therefore there is a possibility of deep vein thrombosis. And in the postmenopausal, not in the state, not in Turner's patients, but in postmenopausal HRT, you have an increased incidence of stroke when you take oral HRT. MI is also increased. There are nearly 8 stroke and 8 MI events per 1,000 women treated for 10 years. For 10,000 women years of exposure, you have 8 extra episodes of stroke and MI. But anyhow, another issue is that when you take it orally, then more of estrogen metabolites are formed, like estrogen sulfate. We don't know the effects on the body, but the overall bioactivity of estrogen in circulation is more when the patient takes orally than when it is taken transdermally. Then second route is transvaginal route, which we have got your Evalon cream and other things, but it's not going to maintain sustained levels of estrogen, though it does get absorbed, but and it can cause breast development, but it's not a method of choice for prepubertal girls because of the intact hymen. Then parenteral route means injection, that is monthly injections. This is one of the options, but the patients will not prefer it because of the need for injection. So all said and done, transdermal route appears to be the most stable and the most suitable form of estrogen therapy because of its direct administration of estrogen into systemic circulation rather than into the liver, and it provides very stable levels of estrogen. But there are some differences between oral and transdermal estrogen. In some cases oral scores, and in some cases it's a transdermal estrogen which is better. First is HDL concentrations are lower in transdermal estrogen, and this is consistent. Across 5 studies, they have shown that HDL levels are 8.09 lower with transdermal estrogen. So actually in this case, the transdermal estrogen is not doing as well as the oral estrogen. But the transdermal estrogen produces better lumbar Z scores than the oral estrogen. There are 2 studies to substantiate this. But overall, there is not much difference there's hardly any difference in glucose levels, insulin levels, protein turnover, lipolysis, C-reactive protein, or any change in the body composition because of exposure to either oral or transdermal estrogen. But as I earlier said, one of the advantages of oral as well as transdermal estrogen is liver enzymes suppression, and these liver enzymes are equally suppressed by both modalities of treatment. Then again, as far as the type of agent, now there are so many estrogens. So there estradiol is there, estradiol valerate, micronized estradiol, conjugated equine estrogen, and ethinyl estradiol. So of this, the natural form, that is estradiol, micronized estradiol, is the best because it has a low BP lowering effect. As we know that estrogen sensitizes the endovascular lining to nitric oxide. It increases nitric oxide production, produces vasodilatation. So it actually lowers the BP. But the ethinyl estradiol used in the contraceptives, that dose actually we are not using for HRT, but the dose which is normally used in the contraceptives may actually raise the BP. And then the thromboembolic risk is maximum with conjugated equine estrogen. And that's why this conjugated equine estrogen, which we are routinely using in India earlier for induction of puberty in Turners, is no longer to be used because of the thromboembolic risk, which is more common in obesity. And also, it was found that in the same age group, roughly same as the Turner's age group, we have the male to female transgenders. And when these male to female transgenders are given conjugated equine estrogen, then the clinical thromboembolic events were increased. So for these reasons, conjugated equine estrogen is not preferred for induction of puberty in Turners. Then a very important issue comes, what is the effect of giving? As I said, by 11 years of age, you start monitoring the gonadotropins, and when the gonadotropin increases, by 11 to 12 years of age, you start treating with estrogen. But as we know that girls grow up to 15 years of age, and in Turners, if you don't give estrogen, there is a potential for further growth beyond 15 years because the epiphysis will remain unfused. And already we know that Turners have got 20 centimeter height differential compared to normal girls. So we want to maximize the height gain while giving growth hormone. And now growth hormone is almost a universal form of treatment in, when patient can afford it, so that the height can be gained. But definitely estradiol causes early maturation of the bone and causes fusion of epiphysis. And oral ethinyl estradiol has also been shown to suppress insulin-like growth factor 1 in the growth hormone naive Turner. So oral ethinyl estradiol not exceeding 3 microgram should be given till the growth has been stopped. That is still 14 years of age. You have to give not more than 3 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol because of its IGF-1 suppressing effect and because of its ability to cause early maturation of the epiphysis. But very interestingly, this is what we normally talk about as pubertal ethinyl estradiol replacement, not exceeding 3 microgram up to 14 years of age. But very interestingly, ultra low dose ethinyl estradiol in the dose of 25 to 50 nanogram per kg per day in very low doses, given pre-puberty, not for the puberty induction, but given as a synergistic to growth hormone. You know that growth hormone and estrogen synergize to produce IGF-1 response. So at very low doses, and that is what is called as the growth spurt. So we have the growth spurt in normal puberty, which begins before the just before the onset of puberty. And somehow to mimic that, some people tried in 2011. There was a paper from Ross about the use of ultra low dose estrogen in the pre-pubertal years. Pre-pubertal years means from 5 to 12 years of age. And they found that if you use ultra low dose ethinyl estradiol, you actually get 2.1 centimeter extra height. This is similar to the height which you get with oxandrolone. So you can think that oxandrolone and estrogen both cause synergize with growth hormone to cause a modest increase in the height, final height. In addition, there was improvement in cognition, memory, and proper thelarchy at the correct time, not early thelarchy, just proper thelarchy at the correct time was achieved in 1/4 of the patients. So, but the study was only done once, and that was in 2011, and subsequently nobody has reproduced the study. So, the Endocrine Society does not recommend the use of very low dose estrogen at pre-pubertal age group. So, again, regarding the height, the mode of administration is very important. The oral ethinyl estradiol suppresses IGF-1, but that kind of suppression does not happen with the transdermal or the depot, that is injection estrogen. For example, it was found that in one French data on 1,500 girls with Turner syndrome who are on growth hormone therapy, if you gave transdermal estrogen to induce puberty versus the oral estrogen, you get 2.1 centimeter. Coincidentally, this is also 2.1 centimeter. This is 2.1 centimeter taller than those who are taking oral estrogen. So definitely transdermal estrogen has less impact on the height. Then coming to the depot estradiol, again depot estradiol in very low doses does not appear to impair height. And if you give earlier estradiol versus later estradiol administration, depot estradiol administration did not affect the height. So it seems that the parenteral mode of estrogen therapy has less effect on height than the oral mode of estrogen therapy, which is a very important consideration in patients with Turner's. Then, so what are the guidelines for starting estrogen therapy? You should start at the age of 11 to 12 years, provided that the gonadotropins are elevated. And you have to start at low dose, as I said, not exceeding 3 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol before 14 years of age in order to prevent any impairment in the height. And thirdly, you have to escalate the dose. Every 6 months, escalation is usually carried out. And until you reach the adult dose, which is reached over a period of 2 to 3 years. And always prefer transdermal estrogen because of less impact on height and lesser thrombogenicity. And this is just a table showing the starting dose and the final dose. And this transdermal estrogen that has the lowest size is 25 microgram, but actually 14 microgram is also available. So if it is a 25 microgram patch, it has to be cut into 4 parts in order to ensure that adequate, not excessive estradiol is given in the beginning. And micronized estradiol, we don't have micronized estradiol here, but what we have here is estradiol valerate, which is actually an ester of estradiol. It's not the same as micronized estradiol, but the dosing is really practically the same. So you start with, we have 2 milligram tablet, 2 microgram tablet here, and you have to start with 1/8 of a tablet, which is a very difficult exercise. But you have to start slow in order to ensure that the height is maintained and to develop proper contour of the breast also. And to prevent any breakthrough bleeding, early breakthrough bleeding. So you have to give a low dose, gradually build up as it is in normal puberty. And depot estradiol is also not available here, but this is basically an IM injection of estradiol. And starting dose again very slow, and then adult dose is 2 mg per month. Ethinyl estradiol, you start with 2 microgram. We have this Linoral tablet, which is 5 microgram and 10 microgram. So you have to start with 2 microgram. And up to 14 years of age, you have to keep it below 3 microgram. And increment, I said, every 6 months you have to achieve the increments, which each increment could be like 25, 50, 100% dose escalation. Over 4 to 6 dose escalations, you will achieve the adult dose over a period of 2 to 3 years. But do not think that this estrogen will suppress the FSH. We cannot suppress FSH with the small dose of estrogen that we're giving. This estrogen is only for pubertal induction. It is not a suppressive dose for FSH. For that, you have to go for the high dose OCPs, not even low dose OCPs also do not suppress FSH effectively. Then when to start progesterone? Progesterone has to be started if the breakthrough bleeding occurs, because otherwise you'll have estrogen breakthrough bleeding can be totally unpredictable and very severe also. So you need to introduce progesterone, but you should not introduce progesterone early because it affects the it has anti-estrogenic action and affects the development of the breast and the shape of the breast, as well as on the size of the uterus also. So add it only when the breakthrough bleeding has occurred. In case there's no breakthrough bleeding for 2 years, you can add it after 2 years in order to prevent only estrogen action on the endometrium, which will lead to endometrial hyperplasia. And in future, it can even lead to endometrial carcinoma. So intermittent progesterone has to be given. Again, the natural form of the progesterone, which has minimal activity of other types like androgenic activity or anti-cortisol, cortisol receptor activity. All those are minimized when we give the natural form, that is 100 to 200 microgram, or you can give 5 milligrams of medroxyprogesterone acetate. Generally, when you are giving the HRT, the estrogen is given continuously and the progesterone is given intermittently. And you can give it on the same date every month, say 1st of the month to 10th of the month, 10 days. Like that, you can give every month to get intermittent withdrawal bleeding. And this, when to stop it, you have to stop it only at the time of menopause, because after menopause, you have to see whether the risk and the benefit ratio. The benefit is the maintenance of the bone age, and the risk is a lot of risks are there, like acute MI, increased risk of MI, stroke, even breast cancer to a certain extent. So you have to see the risk benefit ratio. There's no need to continue till beyond the menopausal age in most women, unless specific indication is there. Of course, there is a possibility of fertility in Turner syndrome. And why I'm talking about this, the pubertal age group, is because this window period for which the fertility occurs, that is very, very short, because there is rapid atresia of the ova, and very quickly the patient will have stoppage of periods and primary ovarian failure. So another issue is that a successful spontaneous pregnancy occurs only in around 4.8 to 7.6%. So if the child is married, they should not postpone the pregnancy. They should go for the pregnancy as early as possible. But then again, the same problem is there, that the offspring may also suffer from Turner syndrome or from other aneuploidy conditions like Down syndrome. And actually, these turners are all mosaic turners, the ones which are having the persistent ovarian function. Other options are also there, like you can have donor oocyte, but then again during pregnancy, as I said, the uterus growth is not adequate in many Turner patients, and therefore only success rate is only 16 to 40%. And the other issue is the risk of aortic dissection. 2% or so risk of aortic dissection during pregnancy. In fact, pregnancy is the highest risk of aortic dissection. So before we go for any pregnancy, you have to do the thorough cardiac evaluation, to transthoracic echo and cardiac MRI to rule out any root dilatation of the aorta. And there is an option of preserve, because this rapid atresia of the ova, you can even preserve the ova, but not below 12 years of age, because you want spontaneous puberty. You don't want to disturb the ova before 12 years of age. So ovaries below 12 years of age. After 12 years of age, there's the option of oocyte retrieval as well as storage. So that is roughly what I wanted to say. Basically, in Turner syndrome, the indication for treatment is starts at 11 years of age, irrespective of the height, because the low doses of estrogen do not appear to impair the height gain. And if you keep the ethinyl estradiol below 3 microgram in the below 14 years of age, you are not going to impair the height. And estrogen therapy should be started slowly and escalated slowly over a period of 2 to 3 years to ensure that the normal puberty is followed. Generally, it takes around 2.2 years for the menarche to for the bleeding to occur, stage 4 of the breast to develop, and before breast, and that's all basically. Thank you.